that somewhere that the computer goes tumbling and the cords get tangled in it.
Hello. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great turnout. Really amazing. My name is Brad. I work in the reference department at the library. Just before we get started, there are two little tiny bathrooms right over there. Ignore the employee signs on them for tonight. There's also the main bathroom downstairs if you'd like.
The lady room was not locked. It was not open. It was locked.
It was still okay. I'll have to try that again. Sorry. Thank you for telling me. Hopefully we got it. Couple programs just to make you aware of. The Mob, the Mothers, and the Minister, the real story of the Northampton are regulars this Wednesday at 6:30. Story of a church, a minister, and some church women who shut down illegal gambling in some state of New York. Yes. The African American Writers Series next Wednesday, the 28th, the 1619 Project. Will happen. That's a Zoom presentation. People I believe are meant to have read ahead of time. And next Tuesday, the 27th, 100 Years, 100 Yearbooks, a talk in celebration of our Bethlehem Liberty Yearbook digitization project that's been going on. Getting all those yearbooks digitized. Community members are invited to come and other pictures and things like that, and other things to support. And there are more events on our website, BAPL.org. That is all. That door is unlocked both ways. That door is only unlocked to go out. So if you want to come back in, you have to come in. Okay, tonight's talk by local historian, English professor at Lehigh, Scott Gordon. I'm very thankful that he was coming to do this. And I'll turn it over to him.
One more time, you can hear me in the back? Okay. So thanks to the library and to Brad in particular for inviting me to talk, and thank you all for coming out on a weirdly summery, not yet fall, torrentially rainy and beautifully sunny day. So what I'll try to do tonight is a few things, is discuss sort of the contours of slavery in Bethlehem, in particular how the population of enslaved Afro-Moravians got here. I think this has sort of been misunderstood. And how, this is much more complicated, how a church that considered its black members its brothers and sisters also left them enslaved. I'll talk a little bit about the problem of researching slavery in the archives. And I'll tell you about an enslaved family, Joseph and Hannah, that historians haven't really said much about. And then I'll discuss the 1780 Register of Enslaved Persons in Northampton County, which has only recently been rediscovered, and what it tells us new about slavery in Bethlehem. I can tell the mic is sort of going in and out. So the first thing to say is the simple but most important fact. Bethlehem's population during the community's first 45 years, say from settlement through the American Revolution, included enslaved men and women. Some, but not all, as I'll explain, of these men and women were enslaved by the Moravian Church. According to John Sensbach, the best historian of slavery in Moravian communities generally, about 36 enslaved Afro-Moravians lived in Bethlehem at some point during its first 20 years, and I'll mention many of them during this talk. Most historians who've written about slavery in Bethlehem state that the Moravian Church owned the enslaved men and women here, and more particularly that the church bought and brought these individuals to Bethlehem to help with a labor shortage. This is what John Sensbach stated some 25 years ago in a very influential remark. During the years of the general economy or communal housekeeping, these years from 1741 to 1762, Moravians bought perhaps 36 or more enslaved laborers to supplement their workforce in Bethlehem and in the nearby Moravian settlements of Nazareth and Gnadental. And John Catron, who was Sensbach's student, adds that all of the settlement's early slaves were owned by the church, since Bethlehem operated under a communal economy from 1741 to 1761, making private property in slaves illegal. So this account, in which the congregation bought enslaved men and women and brought these people, its property, to Bethlehem to solve a labor problem, has been repeated by most subsequent scholars and historians. Quite recently, for instance, a writer on this topic has reasserted that in its first 25 years, the Bethlehem congregation purchased approximately 36 enslaved men and women, and most of these Africans were held as chattel by the church. Now, this account, in which Bethlehem brought enslaved men and women to supplement its workforce, seems plausible given a discussion that Bethlehem authorities had in 1742. Authorities proposed that to solve the labor problem in the newly settled backcountry community, it would be preferable to buy Negroes from St. Thomas than to employ white hired hands who had behaved too arrogantly and insolently. The church's frank admission at this very early moment, 1742, of its willingness to purchase men and women seems to explain how enslaved men and women got to Bethlehem. And the example of an enslaved woman named Sarah confirms that the church did engage in this practice. In March 1772, Bethlehem's Overseers Committee reported that there were difficulties obtaining a serving sister for the Sun Tavern up the road from the Widow's Choir. But they'd heard of an enslaved woman near a Moravian mission site in Connecticut who would like to be part of a congregation, they wrote, and if she received permission, could be sold by her master. The church purchased this woman, Sarah, for £50, assigned her to the Sun Tavern, and then sold her about 2 years later, in December 1775. So, the church was not opposed in principle to buying and selling enslaved laborers, as this instance of Sarah and the proposal from 1742 makes clear. But in practice, in actuality, very few of the enslaved men and women that we know of in Bethlehem in those first 20 years, the population that historians have mostly studied and documented and written about, were purchased by the Bethlehem congregation to supplement its workforce. Most enslaved men and women arrived in Bethlehem because individuals who enslaved them moved to Bethlehem, or in some cases sent their enslaved men and women to Bethlehem without them. Many of these enslaved individuals were never the property of the church. They remained enslaved to individual residents. The prevailing picture, which I sketched before, can't really see that because it assumed, as John Catron stated, that when Bethlehem operated under its communal economy, private property in slaves was illegal, and so all of the settlement's early slaves were owned by the church. But in Bethlehem's communal economy, private property wasn't illegal. You probably know that during the communal period, residents labored, but didn't receive wages in return. They received the necessities of life: food, clothing, housing, education, medical care, elder care. But individuals' private property was not appropriated by the community when individuals joined it. The property you brought to the community remained yours to spend or to bank. If you banked it, you received interest, or to give it away. So many of the enslaved men and women in Bethlehem were the private property of individual residents of Bethlehem. Some did become the private property or the property of the church given to it by these individuals, and in some cases the congregation purchased Afro-Moravians from individual residents after they'd been here for some years. In fact, neither of the two enslaved Afro-Moravians in Bethlehem, on whom historians have mostly focused, a man named Andrew, whose memoir Daniel Thorpe published in 1988, and a woman named Magdalena, whose memoir Kate Fall published in 1998, neither of these individuals were purchased by the church. And I think I'll list here the individuals I mentioned tonight. So I mentioned Sarah, and I'll add Magdalena and Andrew. Both Magdalena and Andrew were sent to Bethlehem by their enslavers who lived elsewhere. Magdalena was sent to Bethlehem in 1743 by a man named Charles Brockton, an important provincial official in Philadelphia. Brockton retained ownership of Magdalena, even though she lived in Bethlehem. And it was Brockton, not the church, who conditionally manumitted freed Magdalena in 1752 and then fully freed her in 1758. She lived more than 60 years as a free black in Bethlehem after that. The man she married, Andrew, was also enslaved by a Moravian elsewhere, Thomas Noble, a New York merchant. Noble sent Andrew to Bethlehem in 1746, and he was left to the church in Noble's will. When Andrew married Magdalena in 1762, he was enslaved to the church, and she was free. The church declared Andrew free only in 1771, 25 years after he became church property. Most of Bethlehem's other enslaved men and women follow these same patterns. I'll introduce you to a lot of names relatively quickly. No need to take notes. Thomas Noble enslaved not only Andrew, but a second man named Anthony. Noble sent Anthony to Bethlehem, and like Andrew, he became church property after Noble died. Anthony was baptized Joseph in 1749. He married a Shawnee woman named Anna Caritas, and the couple worked at the Crown Inn, at the Fredericktown Boarding School south of here, and at the Rose Inn. Two enslaved men who lived for some time in Bethlehem had been given to Count Zinzendorf, the charismatic leader and financier of the early church. The first African named Andrew, or Andreas, who died in 1743, and a man named Christian Gottfried, who was brought enslaved to London in 1749, given to Zinzendorf and sent to Bethlehem in 1750. He died here in 1756. Zinzendorf also sent to Bethlehem Samuel Johannes, who as a boy had been purchased by a missionary, Christian Dover, and presented to the Zinzendorfs. Samuel Johannes, once he was here, married Magdalena Mingo, a free Afro-Moravian from St. Thomas, who came to Bethlehem in 1749, and I think left after Samuel Johannes died in 1763. Yet another friend of the Moravians, a New Jersey millwright named Samuel Green, visited Bethlehem with his family in 1757 and brought with him an 18-year-old enslaved woman named Margaret. The Greens left their children at Moravian schools and returned to New Jersey, but Margaret, according to her baptismal record when she was given the name Anna, requested that she could stay in Bethlehem, and for this reason the baptismal entry continues. The congregation bought her from Green for £50. The church still owned her in 1762 when she married a free black named Christian Anton, who lived in the Moravian community at Emmaus. A prominent Moravian in Lancaster, a justice named Edmund Smout, gave an enslaved child named Abraham to the Bethlehem congregation in his 1751 will, and his widow sent an elderly Afro-Moravian woman, Catherine, a few years later. Most of the enslaved Afro-Moravians I've just mentioned were given to the church by individuals, but others, like Magdalena, who I mentioned earlier, remained the property of individuals, never became church property. A man enslaved by William Edmund in Thomas lived and worked in Bethlehem from 1748 to 1755, and Edmund sent a 2-year-old enslaved boy named Caesar to Bethlehem in 1748. 2 people enslaved by Timothy Horsfeld, a man named Tito, baptized Joshua once he was here, and a woman named Cornelia lived in Bethlehem in the late 1740s and 1750s, and Horsfeld also sent a young girl baptized Benigna to one of the Moravian schools. She would die in 1752. Abraham Bemper, a silversmith, we'll encounter him again in a minute, owned an enslaved teenager named Corrida in Bethlehem in the 1740s. Time to rest from the names. Enslaved men and women got to Bethlehem then through a very wide variety of circumstances. In most instances, a Moravian or a friend of the church sent enslaved Afro-Moravians here or brought them here when they themselves moved to Bethlehem. Some of these enslaved men and women ended up property of the church, often by a bequest in a will, and others remained the property of individual residents. The process that historians have mostly emphasized, the church purchased and the church brought men and women to Bethlehem to supplement their labor force, describes the way Sarah, who worked at the Sun Inn, got to Bethlehem, but not any other individuals that I know of. And Sarah is an exception in another way, too. All of the enslaved men and women who I've mentioned, and this list includes most of the enslaved people we know of who lived and worked in Bethlehem. I'll mention some additional ones soon. This is most. Sarah is the only one who was not and did not become a member of the Moravian congregation. That is to say, the congregation accepted enslaved Moravians as their brothers and sisters. And this, of course, is the hardest thing for us to understand. It is one thing to enslave men and women, as the church did. It is another to consider these enslaved individuals your spiritual equals. And I'll return to this in a moment. Now, did it matter how an enslaved Afro-Moravian got here, or to whom they were enslaved, church or individual? Because historians have believed that all Bethlehem's enslaved men and women were purchased by the church and was the property of the church, the question really hasn't been asked. And one thing we just don't know is how the finances worked if, for instance, an Afro-Moravian man was enslaved to a resident, say Timothy Horsfeld, during the communal period. To put it bluntly, who provided for that enslaved person? The general economy, this communal economy, would have provided for the enslaver himself, Horsfeld, as it did for everybody else in Bethlehem, including enslaved people who labored for the church. But the individual enslaved to Horsfeld and laboring for Horsfeld rather than for the community, would he too be supplied from the general economy, or would Horsfeld have been responsible for his food and clothing? This sort of question matters because it may explain why quite a few Afro-Moravians who came to Bethlehem as an individual's property were given to or purchased by the congregation. Among other things, such transfers, moving the person from an individual ledger to the church ledger, ensured that individual Moravians, Horsfeld or Bemper, were not responsible for the costs of feeding and clothing an enslaved man or woman. And this would have become even more of an issue after 1762, when the communal economy ended. But such an answer, the one I just speculated on, adopts the perspective of the enslaver. Would it have mattered to enslaved Afro-Moravians whether they were considered church property or an individual's property? This is very hard to know, because so few traces of the desires or preferences of the enslaved themselves are available to us. It has been a challenge for historians, I think it's fair to say, to articulate what it meant to be enslaved in Bethlehem. To be, as I mentioned a moment ago, both a slave and a brother or sister. And nobody, I think, has put this better than John Sensbach. It's a long quote, but it's beautifully written. I'm going to read it. This is John Sensbach. These men and women, enslaved though they were, entered the Moravian congregational family and were addressed as brother and sister like any white worshiper. Just as thoroughly as any European, they absorbed themselves into the church's intricate web of social relations, particularly the choir system. African men and women lived in the single brothers and single sisters' houses in Bethlehem, where they worked, worshipped, ate, and slept dormitory style together with white brothers and sisters. Black congregants took communion, attended choir meetings and festivals, sat on church benches, and exchanged the kiss of peace with whites. Occasionally, in the workplace, they held managerial positions, even supervising white brethren. Black children attended Moravian schools where they learned mathematics, music, reading, and writing. White and black Moravians did not intermarry, but whites served as godparents to black converts and their children. When they died, African brothers and sisters were buried alongside whites in God's acre, together eternally in the democracy of death. On a day-to-day level, John Catron summarizes, the restrictions that circumscribed the lives of Afro-Moravians in Bethlehem were no more or less harsh than the ones which bound whites. Of course, as both Sensbach and Catron recognize, this is only part of the story. Enslaved Moravians were burdened by at least one unique constraint. Unlike white Moravians, they could not control whether they could leave the community. They could not leave if they wanted to, and they could be forced to leave if they didn't want to. Enslaved Afro-Moravians surely recognized that improper behavior might lead authorities to remove them from Bethlehem. Now, authorities could remove white Moravians who misbehaved as well, but the consequences of removal would have differed for enslaved Afro-Moravians, who could be sold against their will and thus relocated according to their enslavers' preferences rather than their own preferences. And there's a further matter to be considered as well. The cost of admission to the Moravian community, which could deliver the sort of fellowship and opportunity that John Sensbach describes so beautifully, was submission and conformity to Moravian spirituality and ways of life. Afro-Moravians had to abandon the traditions and beliefs with which they were familiar to become proper spiritual Moravians. And Afro-Moravians could not be passive in this process, as my Lehigh colleague Seth Moglen has written. Unlike elsewhere in early America, where enslaved men and women were largely silenced, almost eliminated from the historical record, in Moravian Bethlehem, enslaved men and women had to perform these transformations into proper Moravians, as Moglen says, week after week throughout their whole lives. They had to testify over and over that they had sincerely and successfully reshaped themselves into the particular forms of spirituality that were required of everybody in colonial Bethlehem. So how could the Moravian congregation have kept its brothers and sisters who testified so fully to their absorption into the spiritual community in slavery? It is difficult not to charge the church with hypocrisy. And historians have struggled with this too, to make sense of how a community, as John Sensbach wrote, could be intensely interested in human freedom, but only freedom of the soul, not of the body. Quoting Sensbach for the next few sentences. Although today we see a tension between those two views and wonder how the Moravians could reconcile them, Moravians themselves did not see a contradiction, and so there was nothing to be reconciled. For Moravians, Sensbach summarizes, there were only the saved and the unsaved, a condition upon which skin color had no bearing. More recently, Josef Postelbauer has put it this way. Moravians seem to have regarded the matter of whether one was free or enslaved as unimportant once a person of color had been integrated into the community. And I think that formulation, unimportant, is interesting. That Moravians considered race unimportant, or that they did not care whether a congregant was enslaved or free. Because not caring can mean sort of two things simultaneously. On the one hand, it meant the congregation treated all communicants, black or white, as brothers and sisters, as was expressed beautifully in that long quotation from John Sensbaum. They just didn't care about skin color. But what this also meant is that because the church did not care whether one was enslaved or free, it did not care enough, it didn't bother to remedy or alter or correct the enslaved circumstances of the men and women it considered brothers and sisters. It left enslaved people enslaved. What we long for, of course, is some insight into how enslaved Moravians felt, enslaved Afro-Moravians felt about or understood their own circumstances. Whether Moravian authorities cared about the status, enslaved or free, of its brothers and sisters matters less to us now, I think, than whether the enslaved Afro-Moravians themselves cared. This is what we want to know, and probably what we think we did know. Of course they cared. We have memoirs of enslaved men and women, but as Moglen's warning reminds us, these memoirs are one instance of a more general demand that enslaved Moravians speak publicly in particular ways. Kostelbauer makes a similar point. The voices of enslaved men and women, when they surface or are present in archival materials such as memoirs, have been, he says, transformed by the rhetoric of Moravian records. On the one hand, these memoirs seem so transparent, the voices of enslaved people themselves. But really they are opaque. These voices appear in distorted form, or may appear in distorted form, uttering the sentiments that the congregation required the enslaved, everyone really, to utter. And these memoirs are only one instance of how difficult it is, even with an archive as rich as the Moravian archives, to learn what we want to know about Bethlehem's enslaved population. It's important to remember that enslaved Afro-Moravians did not produce the archive that we have. The Moravian Church, in large part, produced it. And archives preserve, usually, what the archivers care about, or need to know, or need to remember. Now, the congregation thought it very important to record some things, whether an individual was a communicant or not. Important milestones, such as First Communion. And Afro-Moravians appear in Moravian materials that record such things, such as membership catalogs, church registers, congregational diaries. But because the church considered it unimportant whether an Afro-Moravian was enslaved or free, owned by the church or owned by an individual, these matters are, to borrow Joseph Kostelbauer's words again, things unsaid in the records that the church produced. They are things unsaid, not, I think, because authorities were hiding information, but because, as we've seen, these record keepers seem not to care about this distinction between enslaved and free. These pages, for instance, are from a 1753 list of all Moravians in America. It includes many of the people I've mentioned: Magdalena, Christian Anton, who was married to the Delaware Elizabeth, Joseph, who was married to the Shawnee Anacaritas, 3 single Afro-Moravian men in Bethlehem, Andrew, Joshua, and Thomas. But this catalog doesn't bother to identify whether these individuals were enslaved. Some were, some weren't. Though this warp of the archive, so full and wordy in some places and so silent in other places, follows the concerns of the archivers themselves. It's interesting that it's often only when non-Moravian authorities require information that an individual's status, enslaved or free, surfaces. The county, Northampton County, for instance, taxed enslavers on their property, including human property. And so tax records say what church documents leave unsaid. This is a document produced for county officials at the same moment as that catalog I just showed you, 1753, and it specifies precisely how many enslaved people were present in Bethlehem. 5, for instance, in 1753. Now, the 1753 church catalog includes an Afro-Moravian couple that I haven't mentioned yet. Joseph, known before baptism as Boston, and Hannah. I'll talk more about them later, but I'll introduce them now. Historians haven't written much about this particular family. Add them to our list. Their children. Hannah was born in 1722 in New York, and she was enslaved by the Isselsteins, who lived on a farm on the river's south side when the Moravians first arrived. Isaac Isselstein died in 1742, and his widow Rachel moved to Bethlehem in 1745 with her 4 daughters and with her enslaved woman named Hannah. In 1748, Rachel Isselstein married Abraham Bemper, the silversmith I mentioned before, whose property Hannah became, since in the 18th century a woman's property became her husband's upon marriage. And the Moravian Church purchased Hannah from Abraham Bemper in November 1748. Hannah was married to a man named Boston, later baptized Joseph. He was born in Africa and survived the Middle Passage. In America, he was enslaved by furnace masters, first Nathaniel Irish at Durham Furnace, and later William Allen and others at the Union Iron Works in New Jersey. Early in their marriage, Hannah and Joseph had 2 children, one named Bastian, which I used to think was short for Sebastian, but I actually think it's the father's name, Boston. So there's one child named Bastian, was born in 1743, so while Hannah was enslaved to Rachel Isselstein on the south side of the river. Once Rachel Isselstein moved to Bethlehem, Bastian was sent to the Moravian boarding school in Fredericktown and was baptized Daniel in 1747. A second son named Christian was born in Bethlehem in 1747, and he lived only about a year. Joseph's enslavers at the ironworks tolerated his visits across the river to his wife until he began to ask for permission to live in Bethlehem. His enslavers decided it was best to move him further from Bethlehem and from his family, and so they moved him to Maryland. Later, he was moved back to New Jersey, permitted to see Hannah, and in July 1760, Joseph's enslaver sold him for 50 pounds to Abraham Bemper. By purchasing Joseph, Bemper reunited husband and wife in Bethlehem. And 2 years later, the Moravian Church purchased Joseph from Bemper. Now, John Catron calls this story Joseph's road to freedom. But the sequence I've just described doesn't end with Joseph's freedom. The story shows him moving from one enslaver to another, the final enslaver being the congregation, the church. But it's easy to understand Catron's mistake, if that's what it is, since records are silent on Joseph's status, and since his life, what we know of it through the warp of the archives, betrays no sign of his enslaved status. Joseph and Hannah moved from Bethlehem to Gnadental, this is up west of Nazareth, and later from Gnadental to Christiansburg, also up there west of Nazareth. 3 more children, all girls, are born to the couple in these years that they lived and worked in these upper settlements. Perhaps what mattered most to Joseph and Hannah was that they lived securely together as a family, knowing that their enslaver, the Moravian congregation would not separate them as many enslavers did to black families. Perhaps, like the church itself, they considered it unimportant whether their legal status was enslaved or free. Or perhaps not. Their voices are available to us only in the distorted form of their memoirs, and their desires are not available to us. It is easy to imagine, and imagination is what's necessary, that Joseph and Hannah lived daily with the knowledge that the church could sell them, and that their lives were shaped by this understanding, invisible to others, but present, maybe always, to Joseph and Hannah. We shouldn't imagine that because they seem to have lived lives that resemble the lives of the free, enslaved Afro-Moravians considered themselves free. Just to get back to what I mentioned at the very start, like most Afro-Moravians in Bethlehem, Hannah and Joseph got to Bethlehem enslaved to individuals, Isselstein and Bemper, and both ended up the property of the church. So I'm going to leave this family for just a moment. I'll return to them after I get to Pennsylvania's 1780 gradual abolition law. Oh, I was supposed to show you this before. This is the bill of sale of Joseph, first from the Union Iron Works to Bemper, and then from Bemper to the congregation. This is the act for the gradual abolition of slavery. So in 1780, Pennsylvania passed what it called a gradual abolition law. And this law has been celebrated by many historians. I saw a couple days ago on the Mount Vernon website, it's called the first extensive abolition legislation in the Western Hemisphere. But its most recent historian, Corey Young, who wrote his dissertation just last year on this law, and the registers of enslaved men and women that the law required every county to produce, has argued that the law is really a continued enslavement law. And this is why. The 1780 law required enslavers to register their enslaved men, women, and children by November 1st, 1780. Any individual who was not registered by an enslaver in 1780 as his or her property was free on November 2nd, 1780. Any man, woman, or child who was registered by November 1st remained enslaved for life. And these individuals are typically called lifetime slaves. The children that lifetime slaves had after 1780, according to the law, would remain in slavery for 28 years. These individuals are called term slaves because they were enslaved for a term, would be enslaved for a term, 28 years. So what did that mean? That meant that if a woman enslaved for life, registered in 1780, had a child, say, 20 years later, in 1800, that child would remain enslaved until 1828. If a 5-year-old girl registered as a lifetime slave in 1780, or was registered, she didn't register herself, her enslaver registered her as a lifetime slave in 1780, 5-year-old girl, had her last child at 40, which would have been 1815. That child would remain enslaved until 1843. And it gets even worse. The law permitted, though probably not by design, it was changed after the legislature realized what people were doing, but the law permitted a further extension of slavery in Pennsylvania. Enslavers began to register the children of term slaves. These were the grandchildren of the lifetime slaves. These grandchildren might have remained enslaved in Pennsylvania long past the Civil War and this 1863 Emancipation Proclamation that brought about universal freedom for enslaved Americans. And that's why Young portrays the 1780 gradual abolition law as really ensuring the persistence of slavery in Pennsylvania. Now, county officials were required to create a register to enroll all the enslaved people in each county. And these registers included the name of the enslaver and his or her location, and the name and age of the enslaved individual. Only some of these registers of enslaved men and women seem to have survived. When Corey Young in 2021 created a data set of every enslaved individual in Pennsylvania based on these 1780 registers, an incredible data set, he could locate registers from only 7 of the 12 counties that existed. We'll remind you tomorrow. Okay. So Corey Young located only 7 of the 12 registers, 7 registers from the 12 counties that existed in 1780. Bedford, Berks, Bucks, Chester, Cumberland, Lancaster, and Westmoreland counties. No registers survived, apparently, from Northumberland, York, Philadelphia, or Delaware counties, and no register from Northampton County. Now, a trace of that Northampton County register had survived. It was used in an 1860 history of the Lehigh Valley by a historian named Matthew Henry. And Henry's list, as you can see here, included enslavers and the number of slaves that they had. The list omitted information that the registers themselves had collected, the names of the enslaved and the ages of the enslaved. If anybody noticed this list, and I don't think it's been mentioned in any writing about slavery in Bethlehem, they would have seen that 3 slaves were registered in Bethlehem, 1 by John Oakley and 2 by Jacob Van Vleck. There's also a Joseph Jones there, but he wasn't in Moravian Bethlehem. He was a farmer, not Moravian. So 3 slaves in Moravian Bethlehem. And perhaps historians haven't made use of this list because the number of the enslaved, 3, wasn't surprising. Almost all of the enslaved Afro-Moravians I've mentioned tonight in that long list, Joshua and Kristen Gottfried and Samuel Johannes, and Cornelia and Benigna and Corrigan and Andrew, Magdalena's husband, they had all died by 1718. Magdalena herself was alive, but she was free, so she wouldn't be included on a register of enslaved persons. The only surviving enslaved individuals that I knew of were the people I introduced you to a few minutes ago and discussed at some length: Joseph, his wife Hannah, and their children. And the fact that Matthew Henry's list identified individuals as enslavers rather than the church wasn't really surprising either. 18th century Pennsylvania law led the Moravian Church to appoint naturalized citizens as the owners or proprietors of all its holdings in America. The first ones were Henry Antes, David Nitschmann, and Bishop Spangenberg. In 1751, all Moravian property and holdings were assigned to David Nitschmann. And in 1758, it all passed to Nathaniel Seidel, and so on. And we saw that in the 1753 tax document I had up there before. The list of enslaved people was vertical. If you went to the horizontal, you'd see that all the holdings in Bethlehem Nitschmann's name was there. And we also saw, in the slide I didn't show you, that Joseph was sold to Nathaniel Seidel, but really he was sold to the church. Seidel is the proprietor of all church property. So, Henry's list seemed to name administrators who held the congregation's property. The list in Matthew Henry's 1860 book, that is, seemed to tell us what we already knew, that in 1780, the Moravian Church held several individuals as property. The actual register, then, which I literally stumbled on in June at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, came as a major surprise, and this is it. It includes 58 names in total. The Lancaster County Register, by contrast, includes hundreds of names. And this Northampton County Register identifies the names and the ages of 4 individuals enslaved in Bethlehem, to John Oakley and to a Van Vleck. Enslaved to John Oakley was a 7-year-old girl named Venus and a teenager named James, enslaved only for a term. Enslaved to Van Vleck were 2 individuals, Peter and Mary. So Peter, Mary, Venus, and James, these 4 individuals, as far as I know, have never been mentioned in any discussion of slavery in Bethlehem. turns out that once one knows their names and begins to search for them in Moravian archival materials, there is evidence of them. And I'll briefly mention Venus and James and then spend more time on Peter and Mary. So Venus, the 7-year-old girl enslaved by John Oakley, appears in a catalog of single women and girls in 1780. Notice her enslaved status isn't specified. Venus isn't present in the 1779 catalog or in the 1782 catalog, so she was probably in Bethlehem only a short time. I have not learned where Oakley purchased her from, how she left Bethlehem, whether anybody discussed the fact that Oakley brought an enslaved girl into the community. And I found no trace of James in any Moravian record, though he did request asylum from John Oakley at some point, and so he appears in an undated Northampton County court document. But it is possible to put together a much fuller picture of Peter and Mary. The enslaver, the Van Vleck on the list, turns out to be Henry Van Vleck, not Jacob. Matthew Henry filled in that gap that was in the register incorrect. Henry Van Vleck was a prominent New York merchant who, with his wife, moved from New York to Bethlehem in February 1774. A 1779 petition reveals that Van Vleck had left, quote, a Negro man with his wife to take care of his New York dwelling house, and that Van Vleck was very eager to reclaim these Negroes and, if possible, to take them to Bethlehem. A few months later, as the Bethlehem Diary records, Brother Henry Van Vleck came back from Staten Island, bringing us letters, and also brought along his house Negro Peter, a communicant brother, and his wife Phyllis from New York to live here. Peter, though enslaved, was a member of the Moravian Church, a communicant. This is the membership catalog from New York's first Moravian Church, which is mentioned, belongs to the Van Vlecks, it says. But his wife Phyllis wasn't in 1779 when she arrived in Bethlehem. Peter's wife became a communicant in June 1780 and took the name Mary, which is the name, not Phyllis, listed in the Register of Enslaved People produced at the end of that year. Now, Van Vleck registered Peter and Mary, just to be clear, so he could continue to enslave them. He registered them to preserve his property, which he brought to Bethlehem in 1779 and kept in Bethlehem afterwards. The Van Vlecks lived in the home that Timothy Horsfeld had lived in on Market Street until his death in 1773, not long before the Van Vlecks arrived in Bethlehem, February 1774. Now let me pause to just say two things about the geography of slavery in Bethlehem. Usually people speak of a geography of integration, and it was captured beautifully in that long quote, which I will not read again, by John Sensbach, in sentences that have been often imitated by other historians. I'll just read two of the ones in bold. African men and women lived in the single brothers and single sisters' houses in Bethlehem, where they worked, worshipped, ate, and slept dormitory-style together with white brothers and sisters. And God's acre in Moravian Cemetery symbolizes this geography of integration. Second bolded part. When they died, African brothers and sisters were buried alongside whites in God's acre, together eternally in a democracy of death. And this geography of integration was at times, and for some, true. But learning about Peter and Mary helps us understand a very different geography. Peter and Mary lived, as I mentioned, enslaved with the Van Vlecks in the Horsfeld house. It still stands on Market Street. And at the time, this was on the outskirts of the community, not at its center. Timothy Horsfeld, enslaver of at least two, Anthony and Cornelia, had lived in the same house. Guess who lived next door to the Horsfeld house on Market Street? Abraham Bemper and Rachel Isselstein Bemper, who had enslaved Hannah and Joseph. John Oakley, who enslaved two people, we know from the register, lived a few doors down on the opposite side of the street at the corner of what's now Market and Hetwelder Place. So, though not all at the same time, quite a few enslaved men and women, owned by individuals rather than by the church, lived in several homes on the community's outskirts, Market Street, directly opposite, I should add, the symbol of integration, God's Acre. Perhaps to counter the God's Acre historic marker, a sign outside the Horsfeld House should indicate that during America's fight for liberty, two enslaved Afro-Moravians lived in that house. And here's the second thing about the geography of enslavement in Bethlehem, or really about the geography of Afro-Moravians enslaved and free in Moravian settlements here. Many of the Afro-Moravians that I've mentioned in this talk were relocated even further than Market Street to what was called the Upper Places. I mentioned some of them before, Nazareth and Gnadenthal and Christian's Green. Now I don't know that this was purposeful, but Hannah and Joseph relocate to Gnadenthal in 1762, bringing with them Catherine, who had been given to the church by Edward Smout's widow. And then they moved to Christian's Green in 1770. Joshua, who had been enslaved by Horsfeld, was living in Christian's Green as of 1755. A different man named Joseph, who I also mentioned, come to the church through Thomas Noble, was assigned to the Rose Inn, also in the Upper Places. Another family of color who I've not mentioned tonight, Jacob Airy. He was a free person of color who came to Bethlehem from Berbice as a very young boy, stayed here, married, and had a large family. The Airys lived in Christian's Green as well. Peter Titus, last name, who arrived in Bethlehem only in 1785, and so is a generation younger than almost everybody I've mentioned here tonight. When he came to Bethlehem, he did live and work in Bethlehem for a few years, about 7 years. But when he married, he and his wife were stationed at Gnadenthal. His wife actually was one of Joseph and Hannah's daughters, Mary. Only Andrew and Magdalena lived long lives in Bethlehem. It's hard to know whether all this relocation, which seems to have especially involved Afro-Moravians, both free and enslaved, with families, was part of the plan. Now, Peter and Mary, the enslaved couple whose presence in Bethlehem was revealed to us from that 1780 register, experienced both of these geographies of slavery. As we've seen, the couple initially lived on Market Street, not far from the home where John Oakley enslaved Venus and James. In 1784, however, they were relocated also to Nazareth. Nazareth's Elders Conference noted that Van Vleck is no longer able, at this time, to have this Negro brother and sister live with him in Bethlehem. And so permission is given for them to move into John Daling's old residence in Old Nazareth. Now why was Henry Van Vleck no longer able to have this enslaved couple live with him? I would like to be able to report that it was because Bethlehem authorities no longer wanted to tolerate slavery, but the discussion about Peter and Mary's relocation seems to have begun because Van Vleck was thinking of moving back to New York, and then also had happened because his daughter was getting married and space was an issue in the residence. I need to figure this out better. But in any case, on June 23rd, 1784, the Negro brother and sister, who had been with brother and sister Van Vleck and had served them and had been until now in Bethlehem, came to Old Nazareth. Before they relocated, Henry Van Vleck set them free. That phrase is used twice in different records. Presumably this means that he manumitted them, freed them. Though if a legal document was produced, it's not been found. Mary lived as a free black in the Upper Places for more than 4 years. She died on August 8, 1788. A year later, her widower, Peter, also free in 1784, moved closer to New York for economic reasons. So the 1780 enslaved register tells us a lot new about who was enslaved in Bethlehem. We didn't know about Peter and Mary until this register surfaced. The Register teaches us, too, that individuals, not just the church, own human property in Bethlehem, and that many Afro-Moravians came to Bethlehem this way. And it asks us to rethink the geography of slavery in Bethlehem, to recognize an odd concentration of enslaved men and women on the outskirts of Bethlehem, on Market Street, right opposite God's acre. But in addition to revealing enslaved people in Bethlehem who we otherwise wouldn't know of, the Register also reveals something very important about the people who aren't on it. What about Joseph and Hannah and their family? What does it mean that their names are not present on the 1780 Register of Enslaved Persons? Now in 1780, Joseph and Hannah were still enslaved to the congregation. Hannah since 1748 and Joseph since 1762. You wouldn't know this from Moravian records, as I mentioned, which leaves their enslaved status, in Coastal Bauer's words, as a thing unsaid. One could guess it from this 1773 provincial tax list that includes two non-white couples, the fourth line. One couple, Jacob and his wife, those were the Aries, who I mentioned before, is described in the list as both free. Directly beneath, the list identifies Joseph, a Negro man, and his wife, and three girls. The fact that no designation, free or both free, follows their names suggests that they weren't free, that they continued to be held as property of the church. And a 1779 tax document confirms their continued enslavement, referring to Joseph and Hannah as an old Negro man and wife and two girls, but they are not used like slaves. Not used like slaves, but still obviously enslaved. But enslavement for Joseph and Hannah and their two surviving children, one was 19 by now and one was 14, enslavement for this family ended on November 2nd, 1780, because the congregation did not register their names with the county as enslaved property. By not registering these individuals as slaves, the Moravian Church freed them. Whatever property in human beings the Moravian congregation in Pennsylvania possessed on November 1st, 1780, and it may have owned others besides Joseph, Hannah, and family, it possessed no property in human beings on November 2nd. It was still slavery in Bethlehem, since individuals, Oakley and Van Vleck, acted to preserve their human property, but the church itself registered nobody. Now, did the Moravian Church choose not to register these four individuals? I have failed to find any reports in any of the many committees that met regularly in Bethlehem to ponder such matters, in which church authorities discuss what to do about the 1780 law. The congregation had to have been aware of the need to register its enslaved property, though some well-connected Pennsylvanians learned about it only a week before the deadline. George Taylor in Easton, who signed the Declaration of Independence, wrote that he had just learned a week before the deadline that he needed to register his enslavement. But news about the law had to have reached Bethlehem, since Van Vleck and Oakley registered their enslaved property in September. Or did the Moravian Church not register these four individuals because, as I've discussed before, their status did not matter to the church? I'd like to believe the church's failure to register Joseph and Hannah and their children means the church did not consider them property, even though in law they were. The church did not register these four Afro-Moravians because they did not care or bother to concern themselves about their status. Before 1780, as we've seen, this neglect meant that enslaved Afro-Moravians remained enslaved. But the law changed circumstances in 1780. The same neglect meant that the church did not care about taking the steps it would have to have taken to keep them enslaved. The church's lack of care in this case resulted in freedom for Joseph and Hannah and their teenage daughters. And that's probably a good note of any to end on. For 2 generations, the church's lack of concern about social status meant that it left its brothers and sisters in slavery. Because of Pennsylvania's 1780 law, the church's lack of concern about social status resulted in freedom for its brothers and sisters from that same institution. Thank you. Of course, I'm very happy to take questions or thoughts. There's a lot of people who know about these topics as well, so we can have a conversation. Sorry.
Yeah, the 1780 law, what's that about? Is there a lot of public pressure towards that? What denominations of the Quakers?
I think the Quakers did have something to do with it. The one thing I remember from reading Corey Young's dissertation is that it passed only very narrowly. So there were agitators for it, and there were quite a few people against it. Yeah. So there were liberal elements in Pennsylvania. There had been for a very long time. Like you say, Quakers had been agitating for, certainly in their own denomination and more widely, for abolition long before the Revolution even. But there were many people still committed to their right to preserve their property. So I guess the law passed very narrowly.
So you talked about the Pennsylvania Moravians a little bit. Did they go along with what Bethlehem was doing, or was they different?
Wait, say one more time. So,
Pennsylvania Moravians, like say over in Lehigh.
oh, other Moravian congregations.
Yeah, did they go along with it the same way that Bethlehem was doing it, or did they?
I don't, except for Christian Anton, who was married to a Delaware woman living in Emmaus. I don't know of other enslaved individuals in other Moravian congregations. I don't believe in Pennsylvania. I don't believe there were any in Lidditz. Many of the so those were closed Moravian communities like Bethlehem, Lidditz, and Nazareth. There were Moravian churches in urban areas like Lancaster and York. Many Moravian members of the Lancaster congregation, which again was just a church in an urban area they went to. It wasn't a closed community like that. Many of them held slaves and registered them in 1780. Sorry.
Is there any records of any of the enslaved people in the Moravian community fleeing and running away? And if so, what did they do about that?
We have two Moravian archivists here who maybe could answer it as well, but I don't know of any instances in which enslaved people fled and either were advertised for as other enslaved people who fled were advertised for by their enslavers, were brought back. Want to add anything to that? Paul? Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, I'll just say one other thing about that. When at the start of the talk, I mentioned this woman Magdalena, and she's in a way the enslaved person in Bethlehem who most people have written about, because her memoir was published about 25 years ago, and her circumstances are very interesting. And she's, as I mentioned, she's sent here by her enslaver in Philadelphia, who still owns her, but she's here in Bethlehem. She wrote a memoir in the first person, which is unusual for both enslaved people and often indigenous people. The memoirs are written for them, perhaps because of literacy issues. So she writes a memoir in first person, and she's very clear that she did not want to come here. Brockton, that's her enslaver, sends her here. In his mind, he's doing it for her spiritual benefit. But she did not want to come here. She says very clearly that she wanted to stay in the world in Philadelphia. She loved the world, she said. So she's here for a number of years, as any memoir is going to do. She makes her peace with Bethlehem and expresses content and happiness with being here. But her initial reaction is that she'd rather go back to Philadelphia, be enslaved there than here. But she does not flee. Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a way to know this, but I kept thinking about this whole thing is, did these people who were enslaved, did they know of their status, like these different, in my mind, kind of loophole type things?
Yeah. I think they knew of their status. Many of them had been enslaved elsewhere. I suppose maybe you're asking, did they understand when they became communicants that that didn't free them? Were they confused? They knew of their enslaved status elsewhere, for sure. They came here. I mean, I would think they knew that. I think they knew that the fact that they became a church member did not free them. They certainly had examples in the congregation of people who had been freed and people who hadn't been freed. So I suspect they knew their status. Whether they cared about their status, I think is difficult to determine. I think we think they must have. Sorry.
How did you find the 1780 register?
Just pure luck.
I mean, where was it that you found
Yeah. First of all, I mean, I think we talk about it as being lost. I've talked about it as being lost. It wasn't lost on someone's bed. It was in an archive. So it was, historians had not noticed it, or many must have paged past it, but didn't recognize what it was. It was pure luck on my part in many ways. It was luck that I just paged past it. But what was even luckier is that sometime before, I don't know how long, maybe about 6 months earlier, I had been in communication with the gentleman I mentioned a few times, Corey Young, who wrote his dissertation about these registers. And I was contacting him about the Lancaster register, because that one survives only in a modern copy, maybe the 20s. And where the original one is, we don't know, and I was hoping he knew. But it seems lost as well. And we had talked about the Northampton County one at the time. And it was probably about 6 months later that I was looking for something totally different through these materials at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The Northampton County materials occupy over 100 boxes, or bound volumes. Some documents are just bound into the volumes. And so I was looking for something else, something about, I was writing about musket seizure during the American Revolution. And so I was looking through all of these Northampton County registers, and luckily, relatively recently, I had spoken about the Northampton County registers with Corey Young. So when I saw them, I realized they were something that people didn't know still existed. Had I not talked to Corey Young, I would have paged past them too, assuming that everybody knew they existed. And had I talked to Corey Young 5 years before, given my memory, I wouldn't have remembered what he told me. So it was very lucky on all sides that I had talked to him relatively recently and then stumbled across these registers. It's really amazing. They're just right there in the Northampton County papers. And there are other materials related to enslaved people, not the ones in Bethlehem, right next to it. And a really great historian, a guy named Francis Fox, some of you may know his book, he wrote it maybe 20 years ago, called Sweet Land of Liberty. It's about the American Revolution in Northampton County. He quotes in full the most disturbing document in this bound volume right next to the enslaved registers, which is a charge by an enslaved woman to a merchant. It's an accusation by a woman enslaved to a merchant in Easton that he raped her repeatedly over a number of years. And Francis Fox prints this and discusses it in his book. It's right next to this register. He never mentions this, but he must have seen it because he was paging through those things. So when we say lost, it's there. It's not lost. It's just. Sorry.
Yes. Is the register available digitally at all?
It's not. I think it's not now. It's not digitized down there. Here's the other weird thing. After finding the register in those volumes, which I would go down to Philadelphia to look at, I realized that many of them had been microfilmed. And the microfilms are available, but and the registers had the microfilms too, but only one page of it. For some reason, both pages weren't scanned. So, I mean, I'm happy to share the images, but it's not available anywhere online right now. I believe the Siegel Museum now might have images of it. It might be using it in a display. I'm not really sure.
But you have copies of the images.
It's only these 2 pages, and I have these copies. Yeah, those are the
That's
photos
the whole
that
register, right?
The whole register is 2 pages, 58 individuals, including the term slaves, people not from the law, but anyway, people enslaved for a shorter period of time than life. I said no time, it would be short. Okay, in the back.
When the historians talk about Moravians, considering blacks and whites as spiritual equals, there was a reference by Sensabaugh, white communicants acting as godparents to black children. Was the reverse ever found in the records?
I suspect not, but I'm not really sure. Did Afro-Moravians serve as godparents to white families? I'm not really sure. I suspect from the way he put it that he didn't find that, but I don't really know.
What was his surname?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I'm sorry, the question was, when an Afro-Moravian was freed, as they moved forward in their lives, what did they adopt as their surnames? So that's an interesting question for a number of reasons. So one of the, as historians have looked for the differences that Afro-Moravians experience in Bethlehem as opposed to white Moravians, it pointed to things like I mentioned, the inability to leave the community. And then another thing they pointed to is that unlike white Moravians, Afro-Moravians would not have had, and indigenous Moravians, would not have had surnames. And so they're referred to in the records often as Joseph the Negro, or Magdalena the Moor, M-O-O-R. They'll often have that after their name. In some cases, they seem to have adopted surnames. So when Peter Titus, who's the one person I mentioned who comes sort of from a later generation, when he marries Joseph and Hannah's daughter, I believe she's referred to as Mary Boston, because her father's name before he was rebaptized was Boston. Peter Titus is typically referred to as Peter Titus, I think in the records itself and in his memoir. But really, his name was Titus before his baptism, and his name was given Peter after his baptism. Some scholars refer to Magdalena, or say things like, she was referred to in Bethlehem as Magdalena Beulah Brockton. But she was never referred to as Magdalena. She was referred to as Beulah before she was rebaptized. She was referred to as Magdalena after she was baptized. The Brockton name was never attached to her. So I think if they took surnames, at least in a couple of cases, they seem to have been related to the names that they had before they were rebaptized. And I'll just say one other thing. In Peter Titus's memoir, he dies very late, 1843, he's free. But he writes a memoir in 1843, and he refers to when he first came to Bethlehem. He was in New York, and he got his first spiritual education in New York, and he comes to Bethlehem, and he says Magdalena Moore, I think it's spelled in the memoir, M-O-R-E, became his teacher. But that's Magdalena. But in the memoir, he uses sort of a name and almost a surname. He doesn't say Magdalena the Moor. So it's a great question that I think people need to sort of go through all these records and figure out actually data about what happened.
Yeah. Are you familiar with A. Ray Van Guinea?
I'm sorry?
A. Ray Van Guinea.
No.
He was a free white. His family eventually used as their surname the same name you have for Jacob.
Harry.
Yeah,
Oh.
that means Aaron in Dutch.
Uh-huh.
And they always seem to have been free from a very early
And when did they come?
I think in the 1600s into New York.
Okay.
If there's a question, New York wasn't exactly sure what they were going to do with slavery.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, he came as a indentured
I see.
person.
I see. And you
Yes, when you were talking about the natural communities, you said that. The second what we know is
Christian Spring is the third. And another one is the Rose Inn, where some of where one of the enslaved men worked. That's the northernmost bit up there. Friedenthal, where there was a mill, was another one. 6 in all. I believe most of the people here early, let's say, through the 1750s, were buried here. Magdalena is buried here. She died in 1820. She lived a very long life. Many of the other Afro-Moravians that I mentioned, are moved, or move, I don't know whose agency it was, but moved or are moved to the upper places. So a number of them are buried in the Nazareth Cemetery. Yes, sir.
Did you come across any records of any enslaved people being held by James Burnside?
He's not, actually, I think he's dead by now, so he wouldn't be on this list. I did not, I
He died
didn't,
1755.
yeah,
so
I
before
didn't, I didn't come across anybody that was enslaved to him. I may have missed somebody.
I saw the name Burnside on something.
I thought I saw it.
that. I couldn't
One
read
of
it.
your
so-
lists that you posted.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't see Burnside.
Oh.
I think there was anybody enslaved to Burnside, but I'm not 100% sure. I really tried, the people I left off that long list are names about which I don't think people have sort of figured out much other than just their presence. School records mention them. I'm not sure how they got here or to whom they were enslaved. But I didn't leave off anything. I wouldn't have left off something if I'd seen someone with Burnside things. So I myself didn't find that.
I had read where James Burnside did have a male slave,
Okay.
and in the record, he even sent the slave on his own to go to Bethlehem to get a new pair of shoes.
Okay. So Burnside would be another individual on this list who owned enslaved people as an individual. Yeah. Sir.
In that 1740 to 1780 time frame, is there anything in the Moravian history that references, like you're saying, somebody to raise the alarm between like freedom of the soul and freedom of the body? Did that even get discussed?
I think I would have a good answer, a ready answer to that question. Does anyone else want to answer that? I mean, my first, yeah, Paul Boyd, you're archivist at the Moravian Church.
There are discussions, and especially relating to the issue of slavery in St. Thomas. So the leaders here warned the Moravian missionaries in St. Thomas against having slaves, because it's just not right.
This, let me just, I tried to, my talk went long, but I tried to keep it short. And this discussion that, the Moravians have in 1742, which again is very early, and which many individuals use to sort of, or is the primary evidence of the fact that Moravians bought and brought individuals here, which again, I found very little evidence of. It's actually largely a discussion about white hired hands. I mean, the discussion here is really, we can't have these white hired hands anymore. We tell ourselves that we're doing it to convert them, but no one becomes converted in a state of servitude. They're not referring to the black laborers there, they're referring to the white laborers. And they're saying people will just pretend and will accept them under false designs. And then Zinzendorf in the last line says he's emphatically opposed to us keeping white hired hands. So this particular discussion, which a lot of people have sort of brought to bear on the question of did or would Moravians in Bethlehem purchase blacks for labor purposes, it's really a discussion about we can't keep hiring whites hired hands. They do certainly propose that it would be preferable to bring blacks from St. Thomas instead, but again, that's a proposal and a counter argument. I don't think that happened. Yes, sir.
You described what seemed to me like a pattern of slave owner moving to the community and then selling its slaves to the church, maybe 2 or 3 years later.
We're giving,
Was there a requirement that the church placed on the slave being sufficiently conformed to their religious beliefs? And also, do you think the sale was motivated economically by having to take care of your property while the community profits from it?
I'm not sure I follow the last one. I mean, I do think that some of the movement of people from one ledger to another benefited the enslavers. I mean, they lost their property, which had value, but it prevented them from having to provide for that individual. You would think the church would require a sort of spiritual awakening of every person in Bethlehem, including the enslaved individuals who were transferred or purchased from their friends or from individual Moravians who were here. Certainly, whenever they became, I would think whenever they became communicants, that decision would have been submitted to the law, which was a way of getting Christ's approval for someone to move, say, from friend of the Moravians to communicate to the church. So I would think they would have expected the same from any enslaved Moravian they accepted as a communicant to the church. Sorry, in the back, I guess. Oh, and then Nancy.
Yes. I was just wondering, considering that non-Moravians weren't allowed to be in town without certain guides,
Yeah.
how would the situation be for the non-Moravian the enslaved people when they came here initially before they converted?
Yeah.
Would they have to live like outside the town lines or anything?
It would be interesting to go back through that list and see exactly the status, the spiritual status of many of the individuals when they got here. Peter and Mary, the two people who came at the end, so the two people in the enslaved registry who came late in 1779, I mean, they were living, quote, the word I used was outskirts as well, they were living up on Market Street rather than, say, in a choir house or in a house for married people. I think we'd have to look at particular individuals and where they were physically located. I think most of the single men were some of the single men were in the brother's house. But again, it's interesting just because for someone like Magdalena, who was sent here by Brockton, she goes to Nazareth first, then she's back in Bethlehem. She did not consider herself spiritually ready to be here. She was spiritually ready to be here. She felt like she didn't want to be here, she wanted to leave. And yet, I don't know whether it was a favor to a powerful non-Moravian or Moravian friend like Brockton, or that the congregation, I think this is how they would have put it, this is how they put it. They saw some spiritual promise in her, and so welcomed her into the community. Nancy, you have a question?
I was thinking during that discussion of surnames, how the surname Freeman is a popular surname chosen by one of the enslaved people. There's a whole separate community of Freemansburg. And I'm wondering now if some of those were former slaves that have lived in the originators of that surname.
Whether former slaves who took the name Freeman were also the people who first came or settled where Freemansburg is. That's interesting. I don't know. Sorry, sorry.
Can you discuss at all what was the people being people? If you have black people and white people living close together in the same community, how did the conversation go about, well, we're not going to marry each other? What is that conversation like if you're living in a, we don't even know?
I just think, I don't know of any discussions like that. But there were, unwritten rules that clearly guided what happened. So there were conversations at some level. I mean, there is a famous intermarriage that John Sensbach has written a great book about, not in Bethlehem, but of a white missionary and a black missionary in St. Thomas. Rebecca Propton is her name. Sensbach claims for her sort of places her at the origins of Afro-American Christianity. She was a very early missionary from St. Thomas. Initially an enslaved woman, freed, became a missionary, and spread Christianity. Her first marriage was to a white missionary. But I think there are few, if any, intermarriages after that. But I don't know what kind of conversations would have made sure everybody understood the ground rules.
It just seems like rules are
Right. I mean, you couldn't marry within the church or in the congregation, remain in the congregation without church approval. They also submitted those to the law, to the guidance of their Savior. So it could have happened if they left the community, but it wouldn't have happened given the guide, given the sort of ground rules. It wouldn't have happened in the community.
Can I ask Paul a question?
Sure. Yes.
So I would assume that was, they would have the same kind of.
Not often. Christian Post is the one we usually think of. It's not a frequent occurrence. But indigenous people and black Moravians intermarried. That was more common. Married indigenous people, yeah. Any thoughts, questions, remarks? Yeah.
Maybe this is naive, but I don't know, but when you kept saying the outskirts of Bethlehem, and then you were saying that's God's acre, that was kind of
Right. So in the
bizarre to me that that's
Yeah.
right there.
I take my students on a little field trip every semester when I'm teaching Moravian history, and the community ended there at the corner of Market and Main. There's a big farm complex there, and then I should have used an early picture. And Market was large. The picture I showed little houses on Market. That's 1784. Before 1765, there really isn't much on Market Street except the store, and Horsfield's house at the top, where it is now. The stone house up there, off in God's acre. When an indigenous village, Maine, which is over where Lowe's is, when that village had to be disbanded, that's an entirely other matter. But when that village gets disbanded, the Moravian congregation buys, I think, 5 of the Delaware's homes there, and move them to Bethlehem, and they line Market Street. So those are the first homes there on Market. But until the mid-1760s, that is the outskirts of town. The stores on the outskirts, the inn is on the outskirts, quite north of town, and then the Crown Inn on the other side of the river. And they physically moved the homes. One survives on Heckwelder Place, which can be visited. Another interesting thing that it just didn't seem like there was enough to talk about is that it seems like a disproportionate number of the people I mentioned worked at the inns. Sarah did, who was the one person who I mentioned who was bought by the consultant. I would say 4 or 5 of the other people I mentioned worked at the Rose Inn, or the Crown Inn, and Sun Inn. They were also at the outskirts. Well, thank you very much for coming out.